Good morning, cadets. Dr. Boyce here. I just wanted to go over with you again some of the board work that we did as a part of lesson 2. Just going over the different perspectives. So the first that we have is the psychodynamic. So psychoanalysis, when you think of psychoanalysis or the psychodynamic, they're the same. Think of Freud, and think of the power of the unconscious mind. And it's the unconscious mind which drives thought and behavior, such that, people use psychological defense mechanisms to protect themselves from unconscious impulses, thoughts, feelings, and, those aspects of our personality. It also focuses on the role of our childhood experiences and how it impacts who we are. Finally, it takes into account things like unconscious blocking, repression, and our sexual and aggressive impulses as keys to maladaptive behavior. So just think of it in terms of defense mechanisms, the importance of the conflict and unconscious mind that we all deal with, and think of Freud. So in class, we talked a lot about structuralism and functionalism. Structuralism really ties into breaking things down into the smallest elements possible. And this is tied into introspection, which thinks about it in terms of our nature of consciousness and how our experience is put together as a sum of its parts. Again, in class, I talked about a parallel to bottom-up, top-down processing. Well, this is basically like bottom-up. You're building, from the essential elements, and breaking down the experience. Functionalism sort of takes it in a different way. Functionalism looks at it in terms of, okay, why did the mind act the way it did? What was the overall purpose? And kind of looking at it from an overarching perspective. So a functionalist might have said, why do people think or feel or perceive like they do? They also used introspection. So tying it back to the historical figures, so William James was big on functionalism, and Wundt was big on structuralism. So as you can see, it gets difficult to reach consensus as to what's going on in our brains, because there's different ways of looking at it. And you'll see this throughout our discipline and throughout other sciences too. People approach things a different way. So behaviorism, we talked a lot in class, but specifically think about it that everything that you do is based on an observable behavior, not on thoughts, feelings, or emotions. Basically, behaviorism takes into account everything that happens as we are interacting with the outside world. It's an extreme form of environmentalism, and discounts any sort of internal, processing that we might do. The big players here were Watson and Skinner, and basically, if you think of the mind as a blank slate, which is what a researcher by the name of John Locke took into consideration, we are a product of the experiences plus the environment that we're a part of. So, if you think about the different perspectives that we've been talking about so far, they were split, okay, in terms of the practice of psychology and the science of psychology. On the therapeutic side, you had psychoanalysis. On the scientific side, you had behaviorism. But then, Maslow and Carl Rogers, they began to look at it and say, well, wait a minute. Are we really paying attention to the growth potential and the individual's purpose in life in order to allow them to reach their highest potential? It had a little bit of a waning period, but in the 1990s, Martin Seligman started the movement called positive psychology, which is all about a lot of what you see today in terms of balance, in terms of a healthy approach to studying well-being, with a degree of personal growth and freedom, and trying to raise us up to where we are being self-actualized and going for our goals in a healthy and productive way. The cognitive perspective really focuses on the study of mental processes. And I know in class we were talking about Gestalt psychology, where you look at the way people interpret and visualize information. This is really trying to understand how we interpret what is going on in our brains, and the human is looked at as an information processing system. As I mentioned in class, a good analogy for this is, a computer where you have information coming in, our brain interpreting it, and then action coming out. This is sort of my area in human factor psychology. We tend to look at things like perception, and visualization, and how does it affect people's performance, understanding, and in our case, or in my case, in terms of military training systems. So it's just a different way of looking at it. So let's take this and juxtapose it to the behaviorism, right? Behaviorism really was all focused about your action. Well, in cognitivism, we want to understand the decision-making processes, what is going on in the person's head, and a couple good examples of psychologists are Piaget and Bandura. And the last perspective I want to talk about is the biological perspective. So what this looks at is who we are and how we think is influenced by a couple different things. Number one, genetic factors, right? So a lot of times you'll hear this in terms of behavioral genetics, brain activity. So this is known as behavioral neuroscience. And also the evolutionary past, such as, evolutionary psychology. Now, it used to be that your genes are what they are, and they are unchanging and set at birth. However, we learned that they do change, and there is plasticity, and they are shaped by our experience. So when you think of how we develop and grow, especially with the influx of new technologies and being to understand how we are shaped by both our genetics and the experiences that we're a part of, that helps us put together how we are as humans today. So this was just a basic recap of some of the perspectives. I hope that this can help you and serve as a resource for you as you're studying later on in the course. Thanks.